I'm Alana Abramson. I'm a staff writer with Time magazine, and I am joined today by Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii. Senator Hirono, thank you so much for joining us today.
Aloha.
So I want to start by talking about the news currently dominating the headlines. President Trump visited Kenosha, Wisconsin on Tuesday, despite pleas from local officials urging him not to come. He did not meet with the family of Jacob Blake, the man who was shot 7 times by a police officer, and he referred to police officers who use excessive force within law enforcement as bad apples. What do you make of his visit?
Once again, he is all about himself, and so he really doesn't care about the health and safety of the people at Kenosha. The governor asked him not to come, but he went anyway because it is always all about him. And to compare what happened in the shooting to someone who froze as on a golf course is bizarre even for Trump.
On that topic, the shootings of both Blake and Dijon Kizzee in Los Angeles have intensified calls for police reform. Congress left in August at an impasse on this issue. Do you see it moving forward imminently?
Underlying all of these peaceful protests is the recognition that we have systemic racism in our country and police brutality, and these protesters are wanting us to act. Now, when you say Congress hasn't acted, the House actually passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and as is usually the par for the course for Mitch McConnell, he has sat on that bill, and as he sat on the HEROES Act for over 3 months, as millions of people are unemployed and millions are without health care and about to be evicted and all of that. So it just goes to show the total lack of empathy and priority of the Republicans, and certainly the total lack of leadership in dealing with the pandemic by this president.
So I'm going to get to the HEROES Act, but going on police reform, McConnell has basically said that the House bill is not something that would get through the Republican-led Senate. Do you see any point of cooperation, any sort of middle ground?
Well, what they came up with was a bill that Tim Scott put in, which was really, you know, I said publicly that is a half-assed bill to deal with the issues before us, which is systemic racism and police brutality. That's what they came up with, and that's all they're going to do. So Mitch McConnell has made it plain that he does not want to deal with the reality of police brutality and Black Lives Matter. So here we are, and the only thing that will change that is for the Democrats to take back the Senate.
So you think that really the only way that police reform will ever get passed is if the Democrats take back the Senate? You know,
Alana, that doesn't mean that we're not going to keep on pushing, believe me, because with the president fanning the flames of what's happening in these cities, and in fact, he's evoking the fear of people that somehow he even said recently that there are plane loads of people coming to attack law-abiding people, I suppose, in these cities with absolutely no evidence to that, but he just talks like that to his face. So when you have a confrontation of people who support the president, you know, with the guns and everything else, you're going to have situations which just fans the flames, and the president does nothing but to fan the flames of that kind of dangerous situations that he himself apparently likes, because it plays to his desire to be seen as some sort of a tough guy when everything is to the contrary. And he's not facing up to the fact that we're in the midst of a pandemic with 6 million people in our country testing positive and with 180,000 deaths and climbing. He does nothing about that except to say, well, businesses should open and schools should reopen without consideration of the safety aspects.
It seems to be that in the aftermath of these shootings, he's really doubled down on the tactic that a Joe Biden presidency would bring chaos, and that basically seems to be a strategy. Obviously, you don't think that is going to work. Tell me why you think that won't play with voters.
I don't think it's particularly working if one looks at any of the polls. I think that American people know that all of this is happening in the Trump presidency. It is not happening in the Biden presidency, because guess what? He's not the president yet. And so once again, the president takes absolutely no responsibility for what is happening. He refuses to address the underlying cause of the peaceful protests. And in fact, he goes the other way and actually finds, I don't know, rationalizations. For example, for that young man who killed 2 people and has been charged with murder, he, in fact, comes to that person's defense. So, we expect our leaders to model behavior. And the behavior that President Trump constantly puts out is that he's the law and order tough guy, but he does absolutely nothing to provide leadership, national leadership, to deal with the pandemic, which if we do not get the pandemic under control, we are not going to be able to return to any level of normalcy for our economy or anything else. But he refuses to deal with it. And by the way, one of the only times that the president actually lived up to a statement he made was during the beginning part of the pandemic. First of all, he said it was a hoax, but when he finally realized it was for real, and he said, well, it's not my responsibility. So he is definitely living up to what he said, that this is not his responsibility. He puts it off on everybody else.
Getting back to the pandemic response, the other thing that Congress is at an impasse at is with COVID relief. Obviously, yes. The Democrats passed the HEROES Act in May. Mitch McConnell has repeatedly dismissed it as a liberal wish list. But meanwhile, Americans have been without enhanced unemployment insurance for over a month, and the number of COVID cases has passed 6 million. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin is now saying that a bipartisan agreement should still be reached. Do you think it can be?
Well, if the president and the president chief of staff listens to Mnuchin, and I think that it is a pretty sad situation, if you ask me, that it's Mnuchin who's the voice of reason for the administration. Now, when we were confronted with the HEROES Act passed by the House, the first thing Mitch McConnell said is, well, the states should declare bankruptcy. And the thing he wanted was for liability protection for corporations. That's where he's coming from. There's no push for additional unemployment insurance benefits, nothing for the states, very little, if anything, to make sure that our post office, our postal service can stay in business. And so it is very clear where their priorities are, not to mention that Mitch McConnell's caucus is not united at all. Yeah, I'm told maybe 20 Republican senators who say they're done. They don't think that they need to do anything more to help millions of people who are out of work, millions of people without health care, millions of people who are facing evictions. They don't have to do anything more. So he's got a divided caucus, Alana, which is one of the reasons that the piecemeal bills that they introduced about a month ago is very piecemeal because they're not together on what to do. But what's clear is that this pandemic, with some 40,000 new positives every day in our country, which Dr. Fauci just recently said is totally unacceptable. They're not willing to deal with that. And, it's awesome to listen to the president and his version of reality, which is not what people in our country are facing. So in spite of the fact that the president is running around having these rallies where everybody sits cheek to jowl with nobody wearing masks, he acts as though the pandemic is over, and people in our country know otherwise because they know that they are being exposed to this virus.
Do you think that there can be a middle ground that's reached?
Well, Nancy has said that she will go down to a $2 trillion bill if the Republicans will come up, and we're not there yet. My hope is that we will somehow get there, but meantime, we are facing a government shutdown, and if we don't appropriate money to keep government going. And so there are any number of pressures that are coming down the pike, and all the president can talk about is plane loads of people coming to attack people in our cities. He is living in a total unreal Trump world.
Do you think that Congress will be able to pass a spending bill by the deadline of September 30th?
I am not
loaded question,
but if anything, we don't. I think even Mitch McConnell will say that he doesn't want another government shutdown, and so we'll probably pass a continuing resolution to get us through until the following year or whatever the time frame may be. But there's no question that in the midst of the pandemic, the last thing we need to do is impose more harm on the people in our country by shutting down government.
So in terms of the hardships that different states are facing. Your home state of Hawaii was actually trending downwards for a while, and now
Yes.
it's spiking back up and restrictions are being imposed again. What do you
Yes.
think went wrong? Why do you think that happened?
Well, what we're dealing with is a transmission issue, and so our numbers remain low per 100,000, whatever that matrix is. But this is what happens when people begin to relax what they're doing and not paying attention to the fact that we need to continue to wear masks, do social distancing, to wash our hands, and all the things that Dr. Fauci keeps repeating on a daily basis. That's what we have to do. And this is why when restrictions are relaxed all across the country, you're seeing an increase in the number of cases. And this is why, we're not going to get control over this virus until we all take the individual responsibility. And again, we expect the president to model behavior, and the president is going in the opposite direction by making wearing masks somehow unpatriotic, and it's actually the opposite. This is what we ought to be doing. This is America where we care about each other, wear masks to protect others. And so we have a president who goes in the opposite direction. And yeah, he goes to all these rallies where people are not wearing masks, and you will see these positive cases arising out of these rallies. Now, contrast that with Joe Biden, who is a responsible, caring adult in the room. And so in this election, Alana, there is a clear choice as to whether we want to see 4 more years of chaos and mindless cruelty, because in the president's desire to open up schools without paying attention to the safety for our teachers and people who work in our schools and our students, he wanted to do away with the meal program in a way that actually made sense for the people who had to get their meals. So he wanted to end that so that people would have to go back to school. And this is where he's coming from. It's what I call mindless cruelty, and it's systemic with this president.
So in terms of schools, Hawaii, in part because of these case numbers rising, decided to start their schools virtually. So most of the public schools are obviously starting virtually.
Yes.
A lot of the private schools are starting in person because they have the funds to make sure that it's done safely. Educational experts are saying that this is just going to exacerbate educational inequities. What are you telling to parents who are concerned that their children are going to fall behind because they're in the public school system?
What I'm hearing from the parents is, first and foremost, they want their kids to go into a safe environment, and they do not feel assured that that's what we're going to be providing. Clearly, there needs to be resources. This is why the HEROES Act needs to be passed that will provide more resources. If you're going to have smaller classrooms, for example, you have to hire more teachers. We know that there are a lot of kids traumatized by what they're experiencing through this this pandemic. So you need to hire psychologists, therapists, counselors. You need to make sure that there are cleaning supplies. There are a whole range of things that we need to do to ensure that our schools can open safely. And so this is another thing that Joe Biden has said. He would listen to the experts and the scientists on how we can safely reopen our schools, and he would push for the resources that's needed to enable our schools to reopen. And that's why federal support is necessary. And that's not forthcoming from the Republicans in the Senate.
Should that be a priority in any of the COVID relief packages?
Of course. We all want the schools to reopen, Alana. And in fact, I was talking with the teachers. For one thing, they have to get retrained. Many of them, they have to get trained to do distance teaching. And then one of the teachers, she said when she first started distance teaching, that maybe about 40% of her classroom kids were participating. By the end of the term, it was only about 10%. So there's a huge drop-off, which also acknowledges that distance learning is really tough for the students to pay attention, all that. So there's learning loss that is happening that we all need to deal with. And then it's also been pointing out that not every child has access to the internet. And so part of what we did with the CARES Act was to provide funding to enable connectivity, but it's still not 100%. So there are any number of huge challenges facing reopening of our schools. We all want our schools to reopen because aside from the safety issues, I am really concerned about the learning loss that is occurring with our kids.
When you talk to constituents, when you talk to these teachers, these parents, what's the number one thing that they say they want from the federal government in terms of the next relief package?
They want to have the resources necessary to reopen our schools. But that also means that we need to get a better control over the spread of this virus. And so the governor recently imposed a stay-at-home order because that's what we should be doing, since we do see an increase in the number of positive cases, and a continuous reinforcement of the need to wear masks, to wash our hands, social distancing, do not go into crowded spaces. All the things that the president never talks about, but thank goodness Dr. Fauci does. He hammers that home every day. And the other thing, Alana, is that when we have a vaccine, which the vaccine has to be both safe and effective, we don't want to cut any corners on the safety or effectiveness of a vaccine. And that is why the CDC, the FDA have to be left alone to do their jobs and based on science. But we already know that there's a lot of political pressure being placed on all of these entities that the president just wants a vaccine. He wants it by next month. We actually have a process for determining whether a vaccine is effective and safe. And we should not be cutting those corners, because people will not trust government to provide a safe vaccine if all they're hearing is interference, political interference with what should be a medical scientific basis for developing such a vaccine.
So we've talked a lot about how a lot of things in Congress are stalled because Republicans and Democrats can't come to an agreement. Mm-hmm. Democrats, polling is showing that they could take back the Senate, and that sparked a conversation about whether or not you should get rid of the filibuster, which, as you know, requires 60 votes to pass. Do you think that Democrats should try and get rid of it so that votes pass by majority legislation?
I was of the opinion that the filibuster was important to retain minority voices, but notice that we Democrats are in the minority, and it's not as though our voices are being protected. Frankly, I am open to filibuster reform because we cannot continue with this kind of impasse in the Senate. And frankly, Mitch McConnell really opened the door to that when he totally did away with a 60-vote requirement for confirming Supreme Court justices. The Democrats held the line on the Supreme Court justices, but Mitch McConnell threw it right out the window because he needed to confirm 2 more justices, and so that's where they're going. I look at all of the challenges facing us because when Joe and Kamala get elected, that is my hope, of course, because the alternative is continuous chaos and mindless cruelty perpetuated by the cult of Trump. There's going to be a lot of rebuilding that we're going to need to do, a lot of coming together. Things are not going to change overnight, of course, so we need a leadership that will pay attention to what we actually need to do based on facts, based on science, based on what's best for our people as opposed to what's best for Trump.
Obviously, our country is in unprecedented turbulence right now. What has given you hope historically during tough times, and what's giving you hope now?
I think there are a lot of young people who I would say they have woke, and they're going to stay woke. They're going to remain engaged. And look at the voter turnout. If we can withstand the voter suppression that is taking place all across the country, not to mention what's happening with the Postal Service, the kind of voter turnout that we saw in Massachusetts means that people are very engaged. And believe me, when they think that somebody's trying to take away their vote, I think that incentivizes them even more. I think the clear choices that our country is facing between continuing chaos with the president and this quixotic kind of snake oil leadership that he's providing with regard to the pandemic, which is no leadership, versus the kind of adult leadership that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris will bring, there's a clear choice. And I think there are a lot of people who are going to come out to vote. And that is another reason that we need to support the Postal Service. And the fact that the Postmaster DeJoy, who my friend Amy said he's actually no joy, and when he says that he has put a pause on all these things that have led to delays in people getting their medications, Social Security checks, and sending in their ballots, it is hard to really take the word of any Trump acolyte, and that's what the Postmaster General is. And so we have to remain vigilant, and that's what we're going to do. I am energized by the young people who are out there and all the people who want justice done in our country, and they want police reform that's meaningful. And so I am energized by all the people who are coming forward to say, you know what, we are a country that should be the leader in dealing with pandemics. We should be the leader on taking care of our people and making sure that people have opportunities. These are not just words to me, because Alana, you know, I'm an immigrant. I came here with nothing. And this is a country that provided me with opportunities for education and all that. And that's what the Democrats want to do. But first, we have to get control over this pandemic. And in that, we each bear individual responsibility to prevent the spread of this virus by being aware that we need to wear our, masks and wash our hands and do all of those things. Each one of us, as an American, I think we should be duty bound to do those things that will protect not just ourselves, but others.
Well, Senator Hirono, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you very much. Everyone stay safe, be kind.